Okay, welcome to the next section in critical thinking. We're going to first start off by looking at unstated premises and conclusions. So sometimes conclusions and or the premises are not explicitly stated in an argument. It could be the case that the person in writing or verbally talking has left out the conclusion. Perhaps they left out one or more premises. Could be the both, that there's missing premises and as well as a missing conclusion. So let's first start talking about when a conclusion is unstated. Unstated conclusions, they're common, and they can lead to clarity problems, but they do not necessarily lead to logical problems. That is, they can lead to clarity problems when they're unstated, and that's because it could be the case that you don't quite see their point or what their end game is. You're not sure what their conclusion is. It's not clear to you. Sometimes it might be very clear to you what their conclusion is, even though they don't state it. But when it's unclear to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any logical problems with their argument, in the sense that there's something logically mistaken such that their argument doesn't work. It could be the case that their argument doesn't work, it's just that they could be clear by stating what their conclusion is. To give you an example where there is an unstated conclusion, let's say you're in a conversation with your best friend about whether or not you should break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and your best friend gives you various arguments for why you should break up with him or her, but then in response you say this. You say, well, he or she is very kind to me and they're very fun to be around. And that's all you say in response. In what you just said right there, you didn't actually state the conclusion. The conclusion is that you should stay with your significant other, right? Because they're very kind and they're fun to be around. However, the mere fact that you didn't state your conclusion, that's perfectly fine in this case, because I take it that your best friend will understand implicitly what your conclusion actually is. So let's move on next to unstated premises. These are when an author believes a statement, some statement, let's say it's P, to be true. Also, the author intends for P to be a premise of an argument and doesn't include a sentence that asserts P. So this is what an unstated premise is. An unstated premise is a logically necessary step between the premises and the conclusion. So you can think of an argument as having, let's say we have a particular argument that has several premises. Well, if there's an unstated premise, then you can think that it's kind of a necessary step in order to reach the conclusion. In order to justify that the conclusion is true or that we should believe in the conclusion, we need this unstated premise. It's a logically necessary step. So metaphorically, if you can think of an argument as being a ladder, where you need to climb to the top of the ladder, and once you reach the top of the ladder, you have reached your conclusion. You can think of the premises as being rungs in the ladder that you need to grab and hold on to such that you can climb up the ladder. However, an unstated premise here is you can think of as also being one rung in this ladder that needs to be there. Okay, so here is an example case where I would like for you to try to find what is the unstated premise. So here we have a classic argument. This is in the history of the philosophy. And this is the argument concerning the problem of evil against God's existence. So here we have the first premise. God is wholly good. And the second premise is that God is all-powerful. And the third premise is that evil exists. And the fourth premise is that, well, the first through third premises, they create some kind of logical contradiction. Therefore, conclusion, God does not exist. So, just to explain this argument a little bit more, the idea here is that, well, God is wholly good, right? Only does good things and only wants good states of affairs in the world. And God is all-powerful to make the world completely good. Yet evil exists in the world. Right? There's, for example, people dying before their time, such as from cancer. There's murders, rapes, torture, and etc. Well, it looks like there's a contradiction here between these first three premises, a logical contradiction. How could it be the case that if God is wholly good and would want only good in the world and is completely powerful to make the world this way, then how can it be the case that evil exists? So there's a logical contradiction. Something's got to give here. Well, we know that evil exists, so the conclusion here is that God does not exist. And what an unstated premise is in this particular case is that God is all-knowing. So this we can think of, let's say, as premise 2.5 that we could put between premise 2 and 3, that God is all-knowing. And why this is unstated and why it's a necessary rung in the ladder to reach the conclusion is that God would have to know when evil occurs such that God can exercise his power to remove that evil. If God is not all-knowing, then even though God is wholly good and all-powerful, then God may not know when evil exists, and that's why evil exists. There would not be a contradiction in that case, right? God can be wholly good and all-powerful, and evil can still exist. And why that's not a contradiction is because God is not all-knowing and does not know when evil occurs at all times. Okay, so next, let's discuss problematic unstated premises. An unstated premise must be something that the author and almost everyone else thinks is true. So once again, people, when they give arguments, a lot of times they have unstated premises. But when they give an argument with unstated premises, it should be the case that the unstated premise is something that's pretty much uncontroversially true. If it is not, then what everyone thinks is generally if it is not what everyone thinks is generally true, then the fact that there is a missing premise leads to a potential objection to the argument, since there is an unconsidered, controversial missing step. So sometimes it can be the case that a person giving an argument may have an unstated premise, and that unstated premise, maybe they don't even realize that they have an unstated premise. That unstated premise is controversial. And if that unstated premise is controversial, and especially if it's not true, then the argument will not work. Sometimes you have even more sneaky people where they will, on purpose, when providing an argument, will leave out a premise. And that's because they leave out the premise because that premise they know is false and would make their argument unsound. Or they might know that the premise is itself controversial, but they don't have the evidence to support the premise, so they leave it out. To give you an example of an unstated premise that would be kind of an uncontroversial unstated premise, it could be the case that someone's making an argument. They might say something like this: well, he eats junk food and he eats fast food all the time. Therefore, by the end of the year, he will have gained weight. An unstated premise in this argument is that junk food and fast food is bad for you and will make you gain weight. Right? That was not stated explicitly in the argument, but that's an unstated premise, and that's an uncontroversial unstated premise. Okay, so here let's look at what's the problematic unstated premise in this particular argument. So here we have the first premise. Studies show that students who eat breakfast do better in school than students who don't eat breakfast. And the second premise is that students should do well in school. Conclusion, therefore, students should eat breakfast before going to school. All right, so what is the unstated premise in this case? Well, an unstated premise is this, and we can, if we were to insert it, we could insert it as P3, as a third premise, that eating breakfast causes students to do well in school. First premise says that studies show that students who eat breakfast do better in school than students who don't eat breakfast. Students should do well in school. Well, eating breakfast causes students to do well in school. So therefore, students should eat breakfast before going to school. So why this is a problematic unstated premise is that you need evidence. You need some kind of studies showing causation that eating breakfast actually causes students to do well in school. And without providing this causal evidence to back up the third premise, this argument in its entirety would not work. So if you just look at the first and second premise, it could be the case that students who eat breakfast do better in school as compared to students who don't eat breakfast. That could be the case because well, perhaps students who eat breakfast have more diligent parents, and these parents also help them with their homework. So eating breakfast doesn't cause students to do well in school, but rather there's their parents that help cause them to do well in school. Whereas students who don't eat breakfast tend to have parents who are less diligent, right? They don't feed their kids breakfast and they don't help their kids with homework. So without the third premise, this argument would not work. But it's a problematic third premise because you would need to have further evidence through running further studies in order to actually show and eliminate other possibilities, such as having diligent parents, which are really why students who eat breakfast do well in school. Right? You would have to eliminate certain alternate possibilities, and you would have to have more evidence to try to actually show causation, that is, the eating of breakfast that causes students to do well in school. Okay, next let's look at things that are not arguments. A single statement cannot be an argument, since arguments require at least two statements. Remember, an argument requires at least one premise and one conclusion. And a premise is a statement, a conclusion is also a statement. So a single statement cannot be an argument, since arguments require at least two statements. We can think of a single statement by itself as being an assertion. Right? You can, for example, I have a brother, and I might say something like this: I have a brother. Well, what I just uttered out of my mouth, that is a single statement, and so therefore it is an assertion. It is not an argument. A single statement, however, can be turned into a premise or a conclusion by adding other statements. So I might have the assertion all by itself that there is a computer in front of me. I can use that statement that there is a computer in front of me as being a conclusion by adding premises, such as I have a good vision. I just had my vision checked by the doctor. Therefore, there is a computer in front of me because I see it. We can also turn that statement that there is a computer in front of me into a premise. Right? I might say something like this, use it as a premise. There is a computer in front of me. There is a window in front of me. There is a wall in front of me. Therefore, conclusion, there are several things in front of me. Okay, next let's discuss a description. A description is a string of assertions, so it's several assertions put together that is intended to give the reader a mental image of something. So you commonly see descriptions in, for example, novels when an author lays out a scene and describes the scenery, maybe describes the room that the scene is taking place in. Well, when the author is describing the room, well, what they're doing is providing a description, a string of assertions to lay out this kind of picture for you of the world that you're reading about. And descriptions themselves are not arguments. They're mere just describing a room. For example, if you were to describe your room that you're in right now, that itself is not, you're not arguing for something. You're not trying to convince someone of something, to try to convince someone to believe something. Now, it could be the case if you add something further to a description, you could have an argument. For example, you might describe the room and the furniture that you're in, but then you add the extra statement, therefore my room is beautiful. Then there you have an argument, right? You're trying to convince, you're trying to draw a conclusion. But without that final statement, which is the conclusion, all you have is a mere description. Okay, so next let's discuss explanations. And explanations are not arguments, although they have some similarities with arguments. So we can think of there being two kinds of explanations. One kind of explanation is an explanation of how to do something. For example, if you have a cooking recipe, that recipe is explaining to you how to do something. Let's say make some kind of dish. Or if you have some do-it-yourself project, right, you might have instructions for how to do it, like let's say build a patio. That itself is the first kind of explanation, an explanation of how to do something. Next, there's an explanation of why something is true. For example, there is gravity, right? And we know that gravity exists here on Earth under normal conditions. If I were to drop a pencil when standing up, it would fall to the floor, right? It would fall to the earth. So the fact that gravity exists, that is true. But an explanation is trying to explain why that is true. And right now, the current explanation of gravity is from Einstein's theory of relativity. You can think of the theory of relativity as being an explanation for why there is gravity. So in this class, we're going to be interested in the second kind of explanation, and we will not be interested in the first kind of explanation. We'll be interested in an explanation of why something is true. I'll give you another example of the second kind of explanation. My computer, it works perfectly fine. It is true that it works perfectly fine right now. But I might be interested in an explanation of why it works perfectly fine right now. And that explanation could be something that's, well, a complex story, such as, well, the computer's plugged in and receiving electricity. It has computer chips and wiring, etc., in a very complex way, and they're wired correctly and appropriately, and they both all work such that the computer works properly. Okay, so next let's move on to some kind of fancier terms here, an explanandum and an explanon. An explanandum is that which is to be explained. So an explananon, however, is that which does the explaining. So an explanandum, that which is to be explained, is the kind of, in an explanation, is kind of the end thing that is being explained. So for example, in the gravity case, the explanandum is gravity. That's what we're trying to explain, right? That's what physicists are trying to explain. They're trying to explain gravity. So gravity, in this case, is the explanandum. In the computer case, what is to be explained is that the computer is working functionally well, that the computer works. That is the explanandum. That's what we're trying to explain. The explanon, however, is that which does the explaining. So for example, in the gravity case, the explanon is the theory of relativity, right? It's the theory of relativity that explains the explanandum, namely gravity. The explanon in the computer case is electricity, wiring, computer chips, etc., this very long, complex story. That explains why my computer works. That explains the explanandum. Okay, so explanations are not arguments. There are similarities between explanations and arguments in that, for example, you can have correct and incorrect explanations, just as you can have correct and incorrect arguments. However, arguments try to prove that a conclusion is true, where the conclusion was previously in doubt. For example, lawyers during a criminal trial, they provide arguments, right? The conclusion as far as whether someone is guilty or not, that is in doubt, and lawyers on both sides are trying to prove their own conclusion is true by providing reasons and evidence for something, right? So the end thing in an argument, namely the conclusion, that has to be proven true. There needs to be evidence for it. However, explanations, they try to show why the thing to be explained, the explanandum, is the case. Or in other words, explanations try to show why the explanandum is true, where the thing to be explained is already assumed to be true before the inquiry. So what explanations do is that they take an explanandum that is just granted to be true. It is assumed to be true. And what the inquiry of an explanation is about is to try to explain some kind of phenomena that is assumed to be true, that exists in the world. There is gravity, and when providing an explanation, it's not trying to argue that there is gravity. What it's trying to do is trying to explain gravity, where the existence of the phenomena of gravity is assumed to be true. Likewise, with the computer case, that my computer works, that's in this inquiry is assumed to be true. That's not controversial, but what an explanation is trying to do is trying to explain why it's the case that my computer works fine. Okay, so next let's do some problems. And this will help you, once again, to help warm up to the homework. So here, let's identify the unstated premise and conclusion. So in the first problem, we have households that have guns are significantly more likely to have deaths due to suicide. Therefore, people shouldn't keep guns in their homes. What's the unstated premise or conclusion? Well, in this case, the unstated premise is that guns are used to commit suicide. Right? Households that have guns are significantly more likely to have deaths due to suicide. These guns are used to commit suicide, therefore people shouldn't keep guns in their homes. Right? If it was something like knives are used to commit suicide, well then there's no proper connection to then therefore conclude that people shouldn't keep guns in their homes, given the first premise that households that have guns are significantly more likely to have deaths due to suicide. Let's look at the second. Households that have guns are significantly less likely to be victims of a crime. Thus, people should keep guns in their homes. What is an unstated premise? In this case, there is an unstated premise, and it is that guns are used to help prevent crimes. Right, so we have the first premise here. Households that have guns are significantly less likely to be victims of crime. Guns are used to help combat crime. Therefore, people should keep guns in their homes. Right? That's an unstated premise that helps connect the dots such that the first premise can, in part, help lead towards a conclusion. Third, a single-payer healthcare system would raise costs. A single-payer healthcare system would reduce the quality of care. A single-payer healthcare system is un-American. What is the unstated premise or conclusion? And if you're not sure what a single-payer healthcare system is, you can think of it as being a universal healthcare system. So in this particular case, there is an unstated conclusion. Right? Everything that you see before you on your screen in regards to the third question are premises. They're reasons or evidence that counts in favor of the conclusion, namely that we should not have a single-payer healthcare system. So that's what the conclusion is, that we should not have a single-payer healthcare system. All right, let's look at some more problems. Is it an argument, assertion, a question, command, or description? So first we have this passage. Look, we need to take I-285 instead of I-75. At this time of day, I-75 is always a mess. And I read in the newspaper this morning that they were repaving part of I-75 today. So what this is an argument, assertion, question, command, or description. And what this is an argument. There's an attempt to convince here, and it deals with an issue that is a controversial matter as far as which route one should take. And we can look at the part of the passage that says we need to take I-285 instead of I-75 as being the conclusion. And what follows after it, those are the evidence or the premises or reasons that count in favor of the conclusion. At this time of day, I-75 is always a mess. And in the newspaper, it said that they're repaving part of I-75 today. There's going to be construction. So let's take 285. Okay, let's look at the second question. The patient presents with fever, sweating, and a cough, but claims that she has no pain that's supposed to be in the throat or the ears. So in this particular case, what this is, well, it's a description. It's a description of a patient, right? It's just purely describing the patient. It's a string or collection of assertions. The patient has a fever, the patient is sweating, has a cough, has no pain in the throat, has no pain in the ears. These are a string of assertions that are merely describing the patient. It's not trying to convince you that there is a particular conclusion that you should believe. Now, if there was something else added to this passage, such as, therefore, this patient needs to take this particular kind of medicine, then we have an argument, right? Because then we have the kind of a presentation of the symptoms of the patient, right? The description becomes premises that provide the symptoms that supposedly in which you need to take this particular kind of medicine when you have these kinds of symptoms. However, since that conclusion is not contained in this passage is just a description. All right, so the next problem we have here is get thee to a nunnery. What is this? Well, this is a command. Next, we have my computer is black. All right, this is an assertion. And this is not a description because a description has several assertions put together, but an assertion is just a single statement, right? And that's what this is. My computer is black. And of course, a single statement itself cannot be an argument because an argument requires two statements. Okay, so next, is it an argument or an explanation? So the first problem here, we should decrease class size in our elementary schools. Students do better when classes are smaller. So given the context of this passage is an argument. It's up in doubt whether or not we should decrease class size or not. And this person is arguing, right, for the issue which is up in question. That we should decrease class size because students do better when classes are smaller. Right? That's the premise. Students do better when classes are smaller. Conclusion, therefore, we should decrease class size. Next, 37 times 64 is 2,428. This is an argument or an explanation. Well, mathematical problems and their solutions, they are arguments. They are not explanations. Right? For example, if you have 37 times 64, you would show your work, let's say, in a basic algebra class, and showing your work, that is the premises, right, for why you should believe that the answer is 2,428, right? The conclusion can be up in doubt, right? You can have even more complex math problems that are given to you in a math class, and the conclusion is up in doubt, and you have to show what the answer is. So in other words, you have to argue for the conclusion. Next, the Cherokees believed that they had a sacred duty to avenge the deaths of fallen comrades, and so war parties formed quickly following a death. Is this an argument or is this an explanation? In this case, it is an explanation. The explanandum or thing to be explained is that war parties formed quickly following a death. And this is assumed to be true, right? This is a historical fact, right? And this passage is not trying to argue that it is the case that war parties formed quickly following a death. Rather, that's what is kind of granted in this passage. And what this passage is trying to do is trying to explain the explanandum, where the explanation, or in other words, explanans, is that the Cherokees believed that they had a sacred duty to avenge the deaths of fallen comrades. And that explains why war parties formed quickly following a death.